Dude, I went to Emily last night. Remember that place?
Oh, yeah.
Oh man, they don't have good drinks. I forgot that, and I always get excited because their drink menu looks pretty good, but they don't have good drinks. And it's like it's weird to go to a nice place in my neighborhood like that. That's like one of those places that's just like booked for a month during normal times, and their cocktails they're not good. They're like too fizzy. Like they're I like spirit forward cocktails.
You need more alcohol. You
Yeah,
can't waste
exactly.
any room.
Exactly. I don't want to waste room on that fizzy stuff. But no, they're just not that good. But they have some nice beers there, so I got a beer instead afterwards. But
I remember there was a night that I had a lot of beer there, and their beer was really good.
dude, so you know the burger there?
Yeah.
The Emmy Burger? It's like, right. So if you've never been there, heard of it, it's like this pizza place in the West Village. I think there's a place in Brooklyn too. If you live in New York, you got to go check it out. It's called Emily Pizza. But they have this it's funny. It's a pizza joint, but they have a burger that's very popular. So if you go there, you just see people ordering the burger, like just tons of burgers coming out. I went with my buddy, and he wanted to get the burger pizza, which is the burger in pizza form. So it's all the ingredients of the burger on a pizza. And it was so good. It's like that special sauce. There's even like pickles and like the meat, like the it's like the Frida, like dry beef, like dry aged beef that they make the burger out of. Dude, it was so money. And I just had a little piece after my workout for lunch. One little leftover I had. Oh my gosh, heaven,
Nice.
man, heaven. So if you guys make it into the city anytime soon, as people do with couples who have new babies do, often go out to dinner.
New babies during a pandemic.
Right. It seems like a nice time to do it.
Yeah.
It was good though, man. Like the restaurant was good. It was indoor dining. Indoor dining started up over the weekend. And so I just grabbed a spot like that day. I mean, that's the other thing about pandemic dining. It's pretty sweet. It's like
It's all
you would not
open.
be able to get a night of table there at all. And so I just grabbed it, and they were at like lower capacity, but it was pretty awesome.
Very cool.
Just fun to be out and seeing people, and
Yeah. Maybe in 18 years I'll join you.
maybe more if there's a surprise or something.
Yeah.
You never know. You
Yeah.
never know. So we missed last week, but we've been working on some stuff. So we got some things to talk about today. I'm excited. I finished my series on the image cropper, and the last part was the dampening thing, which was pretty cool. I don't want to talk too much about it because people can watch the video if they want. I've talked a lot about it, but it's just the same stuff. It was just you look at the code at the end of it, and it's framer motion, and it's this gesture stuff kind of working together, and it's like 100 lines of code, and it's like you have an image cropper and literally 100 lines. No, it's like 170 lines, I think, with a dampening function that I wrote, and the rest, and some of the other stuff that I added at the end. And it's pretty amazing. So there was someone who commented on one of my videos, and he was like, "Man, like, I've done stuff like this 10 years ago with jQuery, and just looking at this code with these libraries in React and seeing how easy it is to read it and to see what's going on, it's really amazing to just take stock of like how far we've come."
Yeah. And the control you get, just like you're not passing an options hash to a jQuery plugin anymore.
Oh yeah. It feels like you're hooking into like a platform level thing,
Yeah.
So it's really cool. And it took me a while to ramp up on it, but now I feel so good about it, and I'm just happy. It's kind of like you get this, I find this happens sometimes with libraries where, I've had this thought before where like, the purpose of libraries is to abstract, right?
Mm-hmm.
If you think about it, the purpose of a library is so that you don't have to do something that the library is doing for you, right?
Mm-hmm.
And when things work right, you are basically saved from having to learn the hard thing that the library author had to learn in order to make the library work.
Mm-hmm.
But inevitably, like, you run up against the boundaries of the library, or maybe you don't even run up against the boundaries of it.
All abstractions leak? Is that what
I
you're
don't
saying?
think that's what I'm saying. I was thinking about that, but like you hit a point where it actually helps you to understand how things work underneath, even if you come back up and stay at the higher level. So like take React for instance, like the whole point of React is that you don't have to think about rendering. Like you don't have to think about when things re-render, you don't have to think about the details of like a render function running. If you just describe your UI as a function of state, then like React takes care of like the actual render cycles. Like in some sense, you might even say like React has failed if you are thinking about render cycles, right? But any person who spent any amount of time in React knows actually like you have to think about that, especially when it comes to things like refs, and actually understanding that what React is doing is like rerunning this function when things change, and which changes cause React to re-render and which don't, help you write better abstractions for your own components so that like other people don't have to think about it. So I just, and in the same way with React use gesture, like thinking about or even the animation stuff, like understanding more. It's like through the series, I got to a point where my mental model of like React use gesture was like deeper than what you would get if you just read the docs, because like you kind of pick it apart a little bit. But then at the end of the day, you still end up using the higher level APIs. It's just like you're more comfortable with it. So I don't know. Does that make sense?
It does. When you're describing React, it's almost like you want to understand like what is the intention of React. It's not just to render pixels. It's to handle like the transition between states. And knowing that, I mean, it lets you think of like, when do I use a ref versus when do I use just setting state and letting the component update? So yeah.
Versus when do I go outside of React, like using something like React use gesture, right?
Yep. Yeah. When do like, I'm doing something that requires 60 frames a second. Like,
right.
Does this make sense in React? Like we talked about last week or whenever.
Right. So, but anyways, it's just interesting. So yeah, by the end of my series, I kind of felt like I had this new mental model for these libraries, and it helped me. So it's kind of like, well, what's the best way to learn them? I mean, it's still to just dive in and stuff, but I think after you use them for a while, it's like it's like big brain, and it's like, now I know how this works. And if I have to use it in a new project, I would still reach for it, even if I know more about how it works, obviously, because it does so many things for you. But it's nice to have that deeper mental model. When Dan first released Redux, he released a video course basically rebuilding it and teaching how it worked. And the point wasn't that you could build your own Redux. The point was you can understand how it works. So it's just interesting because I'm such a fan of abstractions, right? And like using other people's stuff. But sometimes, it's good to get your hands dirty and take the extra time. You'll save yourself time in the long run if you take more time to learn how it works. And kind of what you were saying, which is like, why was this created to begin with? Like, what problems is it solving?
Yeah.
Where did it come out of? Like, that's true for Mirage. Like, where did Mirage come out of? Ultimately, it came out of a place of testing, even though people use it for different things now. So, but it's good to understand that.
It's interesting too with something like React. Like, there's a lot of things it can't do. So you have to understand its limitations. Like, you can't do everything in React, and that's not a knock against React. You can't do everything in React. Where something like you can make any HTTP requests you need to make using fetch. So you don't need to understand TCP. I'm like just thinking to make sure that makes sense, but I think it does. You don't need to understand TCP to use fetch, but with React, you do need to understand what React's doing, because you are going to hit its limitations, and it's really good to know how it works so you can escape those things. Maybe
it's like you should go one level down, but like there's a point where you can, if it's 2 or 3 or 4 levels, you don't have to worry about it. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I mean, I've managed to avoid
people
Webpack.
Are going to be mining silicon and out in the desert.
Right, exactly. Like, I've never had to learn the details of TCP packets. I mean, I've read about it, but it doesn't really help me in the same way this helped me.
Yes.
So it's kind of like one layer of abstraction is good to know,
Mm-hmm.
I guess it's just how we build up abstractions over time. But anyways, so I finished that. That was fun, and I'm excited to get into some new stuff. I think I'm just going to stick to one-off videos for a while, because I always get excited about something, and then I'm like, I'm going to make a mini series. And then I'm like 3 videos into, I'm like, why did I commit to this? But it felt really good to finish it.
It is an awesome series. So
Thanks.
we will definitely link that in the show notes.
For sure. I think next, the whole reason I started this was because I wanted it in my side project I wanted to be able to like upload progress pictures, and to actually upload them, I'm using your library, which is like Next S3 Uploader. And so I think my next video might be showing how that works, because it's just a really cool thing.
That would be great. I can put the video in the README.
Oh, that'd be fun.
Yeah.
So I think that might be my next one, but we'll see.
Cool.
So yeah, man, what you been working on?
Let's see. So You know what? This might be a little deep, so I think I want to start here. So I've been working on an application that's written in Next.js. And one of the benefits of Next.js is you get, static site generation. What do we want to call this? Just like you get at the build step, you get some initial files that represent the first render of all your pages.
SSG, is that what they call it?
Yeah, SSG. Now you can do things like SSR and all these things, but just sort of like the default happy path in Next is all my routes will get like just some pre-rendered shell before, any of my effects run, any of my data is fetched and all that. So I have auth in this app. This is like an app. It's not like a blog. It's not a marketing site. It's an app. And I have auth, and the auth you fetch in an effect. So I have an effect, and I have a auth provider component. I've got an effect where you can use auth, and that's going to get you the current user. And so in my application component, the top level component, I have something that's like, let user equals use auth, and then, if user, display the page component, otherwise display the login screen. So this creates a problem that when you first render the app, even just in client-side rendering, the effect hasn't run yet, and fetching the user is async. And so you're going to get a flash of that login screen, and then you get back the user, and then you render the page that you were trying to view if you are already logged in.
Right, if you have a session.
Right. So that you get that flash of the login screen, and that's ugly. That's bad. It's jarring. So then I put some code in the application template that's like, if is loading auth, just render an empty div. If auth is loaded and the user isn't logged in, render the login screen. And then, if auth is loaded and the user is logged in, render the page they're trying to view.
So it's like a third state, basically.
Yeah, it's like the is loading auth state. And it's just a blank screen.
Right.
So this creates a problem that now I've just completely thrown SSG out the window, because now the first render of every single static file is just a blank page.
Yeah.
So this got me thinking like, okay, well, I actually want to render. I would think about this app, and like most people that are using this app are going to be logged in, right? Most people that I'm sending links to, they are going to be logged in. It's like a internal tool, if you will.
Okay, so it's not like Ember Map where the auth part is like your avatar in the header, but the rest of the page is public and viewable by both users and anonymous users.
And that's what I meant when I said, that's a great
it's
question.
An app. It's like budgeting, let's say budgeting software.
Exactly. It's not a marketing site. It's not a content site. It's not a blog. It's like, it's an app. You are logged in. You are viewing data from a database.
Twitter. It's Twitter on your iPhone. You're logged in, or you're not. And if you're not, you see a login screen. That's it.
Yeah, exactly. So, so I completely lose SSG when I take this approach. So then that got me thinking like, okay, I actually really want the benefits of SSG here, because most of the time the user is logged in, and most of the time I do want like a fast render. Well, I guess let me back up a little. Like, let's just stop right there.
Yeah.
Is this okay? Like, is this okay that if I'm building an app that my initial render is these three states?
Well, your initial render, like if it was just client-side rendering, or you're saying even with SSG? I mean,
with let's say like with SSG. Like I'm using Next. I really like
your
Next.
initial render is going to always be the blank state, because the server doesn't know if you're logged in, since you're doing it all client-side.
Yeah.
So you're saying, is that okay? I mean, that's basically like saying you would, if you can make it a fancy splash screen. So every time you open Twitter, you see the splash screen, and then it waits. So So that's what you would, if this was like, if we were working on this and it was like a consumer facing thing, let's say, we would make it do that. So whenever you open it, you get that experience.
Yes, exactly.
So, I don't know what that beeping was. Hashtag New York things. So is that okay? Well, I think it depends. I mean, what was I just using that was like impressing me? The fact that it was like skeleton screen rendering, or even the shell, even though I was logged in,
Mm-hmm.
I think there's a couple of thoughts here. One, you could do the Ember Map approach where you bucket people, so the server can somehow know if you're logged in, even if they don't know who you are. and so you do an app shell for a logged in user.
But this is
how would you do that with Next?
Yeah, and
like
the
in
next,
a conventional way.
The next happy path is like, listen, we can generate the first render for you during build time.
I think honestly, if I was shipping something with this, and this was like just what is the real world constraints, I would argue that it probably does not matter. Like, when does first render performance matter the most? I say things like public pages that are shared in cache and all that stuff.
Yeah, clicking a link off Twitter, clicking a link off Slack, stuff like that.
Your marketing page, right? Yeah. So yeah, we've worked with teams that have big apps that they sell, but their marketing page, like let's say it's full blown SPA, right? And that's great. And no one is ever complaining about logging into QuickBooks and having the initial render be like, oh, because you're in there, you open it up and you're in there. But then if your homepage with all your marketing info is also in the same SPA that's growing and growing and growing as you're adding features, like Intercom style, that's a problem. So the homepage Intercom matters as, to be SSG, I think. But if it takes a lot of extra complexity to SSG user-specific internal parts of the app, I would definitely argue, like putting my product hat on, that like we should not do that because it's just not worth it, right?
Cool. So I still have like that if statement in the application component that's not doing that. It did make me think like, well, I mean, one of the questions I want to talk about is like, should I be thinking about every page rendering every component as an initial render? So you might not have things like a current user, you might not have things like the data. So it's like, if you think about it, it's like I'm saying now you should be able to render a user settings page without even knowing if the user is logged in or not, or who the user is.
Right. And you're like, wait a second.
It's really nice when it works because you get these like super slick pre-rendered skeleton screens that just insta render.
But it's effort. I mean, it's a lot of effort. I mean, having the initial thing at the app level where you just say either render the app if I'm logged in or render the home screen. That's very, very simple.
It's a lot of effort is an understatement because now in your user settings page, everything like you have to do like user ? Dot like email because you don't know if you have a user loaded, right?
Oh yeah.
So there's
well, you would right. I mean, you have to be thoughtful and say like maybe you render like skeleton. Yeah, you're doubling your effort because you have to say, let's say you don't do user ? Email because you've already in a different path of the conditional. It says we don't have a user, so let's render the form like without that stuff or something like that. Render a null user or something. That's kind of what you're saying, I guess.
Yeah, null user. Yeah. A null user is a good null object pattern or whatever.
Right.
It's a very different mental model of thinking of application development because you have to think that I'm rendering this thing for X when I don't have X. I'm rendering this page
I don't
for
have
user.
My phone on me right now, but I'm just thinking like, yeah, it's for most of the apps that we use auth on our iPhones or whatever, I feel like most of them just have a splash screen while they're loading the initial data. So like, who cares? Just do that.
The
reason people get upset when an initial page is slow and they start posting Lighthouse statistics is because you're clicking on a link for a news story from Twitter and it's throwing all these ads and images at you and you just want to read the article. I feel like it's a very different use case of what you're describing here.
Right. And also too, how many people are going to direct link to a settings page where they just want to see the initial render, right? I'm basically saying I'm rewording exactly what you just said, but yes, totally agree.
I mean, but dude, it's an interesting topic because, there's a gradient, like the accounting software that you're opening for hours versus the news link are the easy cases because those are literally the ends of the spectrum.
Yeah.
The hard cases is the middle part where, you have a GitHub PR and all that stuff is there, but then there's all this stuff that is specific to you. Maybe you can only see parts of your team commenting because it's a hidden thing. You're the author, so it needs to render that. Where it's like mixed, that's the interesting part. And you still want that to be fast because you're linking to it from somewhere else.
Yeah.
And so that's tough,
GitHub PR is a great example because you're you're not sharing them on Twitter, but you're putting those in Slack all day.
Right.
People just want to open them up, see them.
Right. Real quick. And they have a lot of personalized information on them. And the UI changes a lot, whether you can respond, whether you can close it. Like the buttons are completely different,
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
but you would still want that to be fast. So I think that's the kind of thing where it's a candidate for, extra work and effort to be fast and thoughtful about. It is interesting though, thinking about like, this is just one more thing that is really tough with client apps because, in Rails, like in Laravel, would you even be having this conversation with your product people?
Well, this is another way I was thinking about this, is that SPAs get really hard because we now have to deal with loading states. We have to deal with loading states when we're loading data. We have to deal with loading states when we're clicking the submit button on a form, where with Rails apps, we don't really have to think about that. We don't. I mean, we don't. We let the browser do that. This seems like, okay, that statement I just said, we haven't even figured out how to do that that well with SPAs, right?
Yeah,
if you open 10
agree.
SPAs, they're all going to have different loading strategies, different
async
feedbacks.
button or a router that's loading aware and renders a loading template. Yeah,
exactly. This feels like we're going beyond that to a third thing where it's like, okay, now we're having renders that are loading, but they want to render some form of app shell or skeleton. And so they want to render the structure of the page, but they don't have data. So it's almost like it's no longer a loading template. It's the actual template with, you just now need to be aware of the state that the data is in, whether it's loading or not. It seems really hard.
It is hard. Just to kind of push back, I guess, or take the other side. It's true that you don't think about loading in server-side rendered apps, but like you also have an upper boundary on the UX you can provide if you don't do loading. So that's frustrating. It's frustrating to click a link and have the browser bar like just to start filling up in blue and then like
spin forever.
Yeah. Whereas when I use apps and I click on something, I'm on Twitter and I go on the subway and then I lose connection because I do this every single day, and it says, oh, you've lost your internet connection. Tweets aren't loading right now. Try again. And that's nice. And that's client rendering. You can't do that with the server. So there is that upper bound, I guess. But what I think would be nice, what I want, is a way to opt into that complexity when you decide it's worth it. So there should be a default case that's basically the equivalent of the server-side rendering case for client apps that takes care of this stuff. And I guess it's just kind of what you were saying, which is like splash screen.
Yeah, I mean, Next is pretty nice here. You have the get server side props, and then you can do the splash screen, and then you can do this full on SSG skeleton.
Right. And you can
you can buy into each of those.
I guess it's an interesting question. Like if you were to take the default case with Next, you just do if user render app, otherwise render login screen. And then on the Rails app, you just do normal Rails things. Like which one of those default cases wins? Because those are like about the same in terms of effort. Like you're not really thinking about these loading states at all, right? Mm-hmm. You're basically taking care of it in one spot. And I guess which one of those is better? Like, yeah.
They're about the same for me. I mean, the Rails one might be a little nicer because when you get into like your actual page components and like you need to load data for a table, you do get like a fork because on the initial render, the data hasn't been loaded for the table. And then you have an effect that loads the data, or like use query, whatever, that loads the data. And then the table renders. So you do... people might be okay with that. They might say like, yeah, it's fine that you get like this flash of content.
Right.
But with Rails, you don't. Of course, the other side of that is that with Rails, you have to literally wait until all the data is fetched. So if it's a slow query, you're looking at a loading spinner for 10 seconds.
Right. Next doesn't have anything that lets you like block transitions or routing or initial render on data loading, right? Only in the server. Like if like the get static props and stuff runs on the server, right?
Yeah.
So if your auth strategy was to have a token on the client and never have the server be aware at all of your auth, then like you would want to do that. You could come up with some way to do it on the client.
Yeah,
but you'd have to come up with that yourself.
Right. You could do kind of like what Framer Motion does, where it like Framer Motion keeps both component pages rendered because it's going to transition between the two. Right. So you could do something where you're rendering the new route, but you're keeping the old route rendered until the new route state is loaded. you're on your own there. I mean, if you do that,
like if you wanted, let's say you wanted the splash screen, you SSG the splash screen, and then you actually don't want it to remove until your data fetching logic runs. Like you would be making something up yourself for that.
Yeah, I think you would have like some context or
in
something
the root of the app that tracks for like fetches, and you go through that, and it only renders the same splash screen if it's ever loading data on the first render, something like that.
So the thing you're trying to get at here, you're trying to get at a splash screen that then goes into the Rails functionality.
Exactly. No folk. It's the one-shot render with all the data needed, but it's using the auth on the client.
You know, that's not bad because it's kind of like the best of both worlds.
Exactly.
Right? You get the fast initial paint. You get the SSG, the splash screen.
No folk. You're not thinking about those different states. Like for initial render, you only let's just say, I want to be able to opt in. I think this is, by the way, how Remix is going to work, because I've been seeing Ryan Florence tweeting about this, and he has link navigation that is basically promise aware, similar to Ember's router. So I'm guessing it's going to be the same thing. If you want to block initial paint or block a router transition on some async data loading function, you'll be able to do it.
Cool. Very cool.
So that's kind of what I was thinking. Like, if initial render is asynchronous and you can just say, don't transition. Well, I guess it would just be, you would render the splash screen if you're on the server or if you're on the client, but you have not fetched the initial data the first time the app is rendered, right? Yeah. Something like that.
You basically are always rendering page components, but the page you keep the old one rendered and the new one rendered but hidden until it says its data is loaded. Then you hide the old one and show the new one. Okay. I was just briefly, I was feeling a little guilty about using Next.js and having a blank SSG page. If that makes sense. So
you're saying if that was the route you go down, what benefits do you get from Next that you wouldn't from Create React App, basically?
Yeah, and I really like Next. Like I think its router it's amazing. The fact that I can just deploy it to Vercel and not think about anything.
You can get API functions. So those things are still beneficial.
Yep, and I feel good about using Next, but I did have am I just misusing the framework?
I don't know, man. I really don't think too much about SSG, but it depends on what you're building. It's huge for so many apps, right? That's one of their whole things is like you're making a Wayfair or whatever, and like now you have this smooth gradient between which parts of the page are SSG'd and public, and then like your shopping cart is coming in on the client. And so I get that. That's super powerful, but I think it still takes a lot of effort. I have a question. If you're using Rails, and you have user specific pages and you're using like their caching stuff, is that getting cached based on the user ID and everything? Is that getting pushed out to CDNs and all that kind of stuff?
So Rails has this concept so Rails doesn't do CDN caching. You would set that up yourself with something like Fastly and secondary index. So you would say like this page is cached for this user, and there would be a header that you tell Fastly it's like user 123 that gets this. But out of the box, Rails does this thing they call Russian doll caching, where you are rendering a template, and let's say that template has an SQL call in it that's expensive.
It uses item 1, item 4, and whatever. So you can, user 1, 2, 3, and you say it.
You can come up with a cache key that wraps that section of template so that inner SQL call will never be called. Well, you call it once. You remember the HTML, and then if you have the cache key, you just render the HTML.
So the Russian doll caching is just to avoid SQL calls.
Yeah, I mean,
it's not to make pages that are CDN-ifiable.
Correct. Avoid SQL calls is one case. I mean, maybe there's remote, basically things that take a while, which is always in SaaS apps is always network calls. Right?
I see.
It's just always network calls. So I'm generalizing here, but
right.
So you basically cache a section of template that doesn't have to run, and it works well for things like.
But that doesn't help you CDNify the thing.
No, it does not.
So, have you ever CDNified things that are user specific, like the bucketing strategy we use on EmberMap?
So no, and you don't want to do that. With caching, there's this hit to miss ratio that you need to be aware of. So if all of your caches are misses,
it's making it worse.
It's worse. You're just adding in a middle layer.
Right.
that has to check the cache and then ends up going back to the original server anyway to get the data.
Right.
So generally, when you're bucketing by something, there's a word for this. I don't know it, but when you're bucketing by something like user ID, there's going to be a very low hit to miss ratio.
Right.
So you want to bucket by
like
things.
Twitter's your homepage on Twitter. It's always going to be changing. So caching it would make it slower.
Right. So with like the homepage on Twitter, there's generally like I don't know what Twitter does, but there's a strategy that's like fan out on write. So generating your homepage on Twitter could be like a really expensive SQL call, right? You've got to fetch all of the people you follow, all their tweets, all their retweets, join them all together. That's just an expensive SQL call. So instead, what you do is you do fan out on write. So when someone tweets, you find all the people that follow them, and then you just write to a database table like Sam's homepage. It's almost like a materialized view of your homepage. So if I tweet, the server is going to take my tweet and write it to a database table called like homepages, and it's going to have your user ID in it. So to generate your homepage, the server can just say select all from homepages where user ID is Sam, and it gets all your tweets. It doesn't have to do any expensive joins, any calculations. So that's something you tend to see with like server rendered.
I don't really understand that. How can you get my homepage from your tweet?
When I tweet,
because I follow you,
yeah,
I know that your tweet is going to be in my homepage,
right? So I
can just get it instead of doing the join like.
It's basically fan out on write. So when I commit to the database,
on write on
Yeah.
WRITE,
Yes.
on. Okay, I was getting confused.
Yeah.
I was like, why not fan out left? You know, I didn't understand. Podcast.
Yeah.
Okay, fan out on write. I see. Materialized view. Okay, so it's almost like a trigger that happens. Like basically, as soon as you write a new like record to the tweets table from Ryan, then you can go behind the scenes and update the materialized views, which are deriving the home pages. And it's like anyone who follows Ryan needs to get their post counter incremented by 1 or something like that.
Exactly.
And then those queries are fast because again, they're basically already in the form that they need for the homepage. Okay. All right. I see. That makes sense.
Yeah, exactly.
Instead of everyone loading it and having to do a sum of everything. Yeah. Okay. That makes sense. Yep.
So that's like basically one, like when I've worked on server side apps that like need to be cached, that's like one strategy of caching. It's not like CDN caching. It's just making the data accessible. So you don't, that's a great way to cache. It's a great, I mean, who knows what Twitter does? I mean, think about how many tweets that are happening per second and so on.
But for the normies out there, like you and me, like the apps that we write, like if you were building a Rails app and you wanted to CDN it, and it was you would just do it for the public pages, like when we worked at TED or whatever. You just public headers and fastly set up or whatever.
Yeah, exactly. CDN, the HTML, and then Ajax and the user data that needs to be loaded in.
And in that case, if you wanted the comparable experience with a Next app, you would just it would be more work in a sense because
well, no. Next basically gives this to you out of the box. I mean, what I'm thinking is if you didn't do that pattern where you do the if user render app, otherwise render login. So you wouldn't be able to do that. You would just be doing like a use hook, use current user hook, and rendering it in certain spots. But most of it would be public, and so you would use get static props, let's say. Yeah, get static props to render. Yes, exactly. Get static props to fetch the data. Build time, and I say build time, but it's really like revalidate time.
Right. The incremental static generation stuff, like I use on my work journal or whatever. It just the server is querying Firebase and saving the page in to next cache. So okay, interesting. I'm a big fan these days of not opting into more complexity unless you absolutely need to. I mean, we were talking about Apollo, and it's the same idea there, right? With some of the stuff about how much complexity you want to add to your system, right?
Yeah. I don't know. The Apollo stuff is more, well, I can get into that next.
Do we have time for it?
Oh yeah, just to wrap up this loading stuff conversation, one of the things I was thinking about is like, is there a way that you can make this easy for the application developer?
Yeah.
That you can easily build something and say like, here's a settings screen. I might not have the user loaded, but I'm not writing all this defensive code like
right.
if user's not null and so on.
I think, dude, I think like the router, or having like a router aware, an async aware router, that's like, yeah, async transitions through your app, because React does not have a notion of that. React renders synchronously. There's no notion of async rendering in React. This is not to be confused with like concurrent mode and all that stuff. It has nothing to do with that. It's just the fact that
when you render
there is no abstraction in React that you can hand a promise to and have it just do anything. Like in Ember, you can hand a promise to a link, a transition to, or return from a model hook, and it doesn't block your UI. It doesn't just stop the world until the promise resolves. So it does more than that, because the router is cancelable. So you can hit the back button or hit whatever, or do a different action that calls a different link to, and it throws the old promise away. But it will pause the new rendering of the second screen until the promise resolves. And meanwhile, you can still interact with the app and everything like that. So that to me is the kind of abstraction I would like to see. And yeah, I think that could help, because then it's a higher level that you're describing. The only states, it's nice because you get to say, I only care about these states. And is there an intermediate state? Yes. But if you don't want to handle it because you don't have to right away, you don't need to. And that way you just get to move a little bit faster. And then when you want to like add more polish to these other intermediate states, you can. But if everyone's writing use effect, React doesn't, or Next doesn't know whether your use effect should, is really the thing you care about, and all the immediate renderings between the use effect are things you don't care about, and I'd like to just abstract away from them. It doesn't know that stuff. So I think we need a higher level API in order to like opt into that.
Yeah. But just to be clear, suspense does solve this, but I don't like just hand waving away something. We can't use that today. So I'm I'm not gonna just say,
for all intents
and
and purposes, it doesn't exist, right?
Exactly.
It's not. It doesn't exist today. Yeah. Yes. Yep.
Cool.
Yep.
Yeah, the suspense answer to this would be interesting, but let's not go down that rabbit hole today.
Yeah, that would be cool though. Well, yeah, suspense is the kind of thing that you could say suspend the initial render of the application, and so Next could then take your splash screen and then not transition into the initial render until the data has been loaded.
I guess. I mean, I have no idea how initial render works, because suspense, you do have to render and then throw, and then something else catches it. So you're changing a render that already happened. Again, there's just too many questions, too much hand waving, and we can't use it today. So
I think Ryan and Michael made their own thing that's in this, solving the same problem in Remix, because they wanted to ship Remix, and they didn't want to wait for suspense.
Very cool.
So I think it's probably going to look a lot like, a lot of React routers looked a lot like the Ember stuff, because originally it was inspired from it, but I think this kind of notion of a promise-aware transition is part of the answer.
Cool. Very cool.
So it'd be fun to see what they come up with.
Nice.
So yeah, we wanted to talk about Apollo a little bit. Let's break this up a little bit with my tweet of the week. We have a new segment. This is my little hot take, new segment, and we're gonna get you on here too. But this is gonna be a quick one. So new segment, tweet of the week. All right, mine's from Josh Como, who's this really cool CSS dude on Twitter, and he does all these cool little things. I'm sure you've seen him before. He had this thread about learning like CSS and Tailwind, and he said, TLDR, unless you're building a short-term project, a prototype, or a hackathon, CSS frameworks can be harmful, increasing the amount of time you need to spend on the UI. I recommend using a style-agnostic tool like Reach UI instead. Use third-party functionality, not styles. Now, in this thread, he actually calls out Tailwind as an exception, because it's not like Bootstrap where you get all of this opinionated stuff. Tailwind does have opinions in the default tokens, but they're customizable. But the reason I wanted to do this as my tweet of the week was I was also happened to be listening to one of the changelog podcasts that was talking about the state of CSS survey, and they were talking about the results. And they did this thing where they were talking about how people like CSS, but they hate writing CSS. It was something about like I hate CSS, and then it was like, are you happy with the solutions for writing CSS? And they were like, yes. And they were like, this is so weird. Like, why are people saying this? And why do they have this love-hate relationship with CSS?
Yeah.
And it made me think that I like what Josh said here, where he said use third-party functionality, not styles. It made me think that what Tailwind gives us is its third-party organization and architecture, not styles. So Tailwind is just CSS. You can't love Tailwind. Why do people say they love Tailwind and hate CSS? Why do you and I say that? Why?
Because I don't have to write CSS.
But that's not right. That's how I would say it too, but that's not actually true, because you are writing CSS when you use Tailwind. You're literally just doing it in a shorter way. What you hate about it is not that it's verbose to write.
It's constrained.
It's constrained, so that's part of it. But that's not like, why do you hate CSS, dude? The reason you hate when you and I and people like us say I hate CSS, it's because we're getting flashbacks to using BEM selectors and trying to override CSS classes in Bootstrap.
Yep.
It's the architecture. It has nothing to do with the API for actually styling things and actually writing out rules. Like font color blue is fine. There's nothing wrong with that. So in that sense,
it's the same thing we do in Tailwind, right? We just say
exactly
text blue. It's the same
exactly.
thing.
So in that sense, like I hate CSS is kind of like it's a misnomer. People who feel that, like, again, I felt that in the past, like you're actually talking about two different things. CSS, like the language, and then the organization of your styling, which is like, it's so complicated because of like global scope and the way you apply things. It would be like saying I hate JavaScript when we lived in a world before JavaScript modules, which you and I both lived in that world and we're developers in that world. And people would say, I hate JS. It's so ridiculous. You can't have imports and exports. There's no module scope. You have to load everything in a script tag and make sure it's in the right order. And you're sitting there saying, I hate JS. But actually, like, JS has this elegant, like, functional OOP paradigm that's mixing, and it has like a lot of nice things about it. But like the way you organize it with like script tags and global scope ruins the whole experience. It like sullies your entire impression of the language. So you say, I hate JS. But like actually JS and the stuff that is in the heart of the language is great, right? It's just that you hate these organizational things that make it turn it into a mess. So I was hearing these people talk about this, and I was like, I think what it is that Tailwind is not about not writing CSS. I mean, it is, but the reason you don't want to write your own CSS is because you don't have to organize it and come up with an architecture. Like there's literally books on object-oriented styles and BEM and all these different approaches, and it's just solving the organizational and architecture aspect. It's not, you still have to learn CSS to use Tailwind, but now you don't have to think about architecture because they just basically remove that whole concern.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I mean, that's great.
So that was my thinking. So that's my tweet of the week.
I like it. What about the functionality part about using reach?
So it's an analogy. So I was saying I liked how he said use third-party functionality, not styles. And I was like, he's saying don't use CSS frameworks. And I'm like, well, what would I say to that? Because I would tell people to use Tailwind. And it's like use third-party organization, not style. So Tailwind lets you use third-party organization, which is basically like, here's a way not to have to organize it at all because you can just directly apply it to your elements. Plus the constraints, right? The constraints is what advantages it has over inline styles, right? But if I wasn't using Tailwind, like inline styles, I think would be a step up, right? But you're not using their styles. So you're not using like Bootstrap. With Bootstrap, you do use their styles, but with Tailwind, you're not, in a sense that, it's not coming with a button class or whatever. So that I just like that. Use third party. It's like, to me, Tailwind is like using third party architecture, not styles.
I think I agree with everything you're saying. It feels like then I kind of have a reaction when I see CSS and JS. It's something I just don't ever want to write. Like ever. But it feels like based off what you're saying, I shouldn't mind that because that does solve the architecture problem for me.
Maybe it's like also a verbosity thing.
Yeah. I think it's a constraint.
I think Tailwind is going to come out with a CSS and JS thing, and I think you're going to want to use it.
What like the
so then you'll eat
macro.
Your words.
Yeah. I mean,
yeah,
probably.
exactly.
It's happened
exactly.
before.
yeah. Yeah. Twin macro or whatever it's called.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You've the CSS and JS stuff you've seen before is like you just see these big blocks of CSS and you like never want to go back to that. I think that's
exactly.
I mean that's part of the architecture because if you have so much CSS that you need to now organize it, then you have an architecture problem, right? So that is part of the benefit of Tailwind being terse enough that this is not really something you ever think about. I would argue if you're using Tailwind, you shouldn't get to a point where the actual length of class names causes you to want to like change how you write it. You might abstract a component because you want to reuse it, but not just for the purposes of not looking at the class names, right?
Yeah.
So whereas you're talking about like style components or whatever, and you see people doing like style.div with all the CSS, and that gets so noisy that you move it to another file. Now you're back to architecture, you're back to organization. So I think your reaction there is about that and not as much about the CSS and JS.
Gotcha.
So yeah, just kind of interesting.
I like it.
Yeah. Okay, cool. Let's wrap up after that little hot take tweet of the week. Next week you'll have one too. But there's so much cool conversation on Twitter. I thought it'd be fun to start talking about stuff that we see.
I think it's awesome.
Cool. All right, let's wrap up with one more topic. We started talking about this together when we were in the office. You've been playing with Apollo a little bit.
Yeah, Apollo.
Giving you nightmares.
Yeah. I like it. Well, let me just give my first impressions of it. So it's, just all the React hooks are great. All the use query, use mutation that we're used to in other libraries. It's great. Also, it's just great when you can, so amazing when you can just go over to graphical and just write out a GraphQL query and then copy and paste it into your code. I mean,
that's really good to hear that they let you just do that, and it's not always going through their APIs. Their query builder thing or whatever. It's just
there's
graphical.
it's amazing. It's just I work so quickly when I can do that.
That is really cool.
So I guess like one of the first things I ran into was the Apollo cache, which is we've heard other folks talk about this. Apollo does some like normalization when you make queries, and I guess Apollo does some caching when you make queries. So if you ever make that same query again, it just renders from cache.
That exact same query.
Yes. It also does some normalization where it will basically pick out all the objects that are returned in that query. And I guess for most like SaaS app builders, this is going to be like the models, right? There aren't models in Apollo, but it's what we would think of as models when we talk about these things.
If you were building a Rails backend or something, you'd have a users table and
users,
table,
posts, comments.
Posts, right.
All that stuff. So then when you do a mutation, like an update or a delete, well, update is a special case, but when you do a delete or a create, it doesn't go back and change the previous queries you've done. So you have to go in, basically attached to your mutation as a way to update the cache. So this is, it gets interesting. Like I have a modal that creates a new account. It's just a simple modal that adds a user. It's really easy. I just fire off a mutation and I, call a handler to the thing that rendered the modal. And so, but now my modal's like reaching into the cache, adding a user. For ads, it's not that bad, right? Because for ads, it's probably always the same, right? Like I have a list of users, I add a user. What does that mean? Well, I just take my list of users and add that thing. It's probably the same for like everything you can add in your system, whether you're adding a blog post, a comment, or a user. For deletes, you also have to do the same thing, right? If you do a delete mutation, you now have to go figure out what to change in the cache.
That just strikes me as ridiculous. Like the first time I started, like the very first React app that I wrote, and I was like deleting a to-do and like going through my React state and removing it or whatever I was very frustrated by that. It made me very perturbed and irked.
It's interesting. It's like the complete opposite of Ember Data, right? Because Ember Data is like, well, like, look, let's not be silly. You're adding a to do. We all know what this means. Yeah. Like, let's not kid ourselves.
Yeah, we're gonna update that list for you in the master view. No problem.
Yeah.
Thanks, Ember.
But there's something nice about like it's really just like I just did this thing. Here's how my underlying data changes, and I'm in complete control of it.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting that the cool thing about it is like for Ember Data to work, you needed normalize and serialize, and those were like could be bears if you didn't abide by them exactly. That's what turned it into a normalized format that Ember Data expected and was able to do its magic for you. Whereas here, it's like they've optimized for a different case, which is copying and pasting arbitrary queries and mutations from graphical into your app. So for that to work, then they can't force you or expect you to normalize things.
Yeah.
But then that means you have to do it yourself.
And yeah. And
so what you were saying in the office was like it's like tempting to want to generalize it, but then you realize like that's very hard. And so what you basically have been doing is like just doing it one-off ways when you need it, when you need the cache to reflect the newest thing after a user takes an action.
Yeah. So I definitely was just like, okay, an add is always the same. Can I just make a function that I pass to like every cache updater that to handle ads with? And I was like, no. This is how you start writing an ORM, and we don't want to go down this road.
All right.
They give you a bunch of helpers that make it easy, and I got to say, like after a week of like just reaching into the cache and updating things, I feel pretty confident with it. It's also amazing. It's one of those things when you get it working, it's just amazing because as you start clicking around your app, you just know that all the data's right.
That's pretty cool.
And you just know that like I added something on page 2, and when I go back to page 1, I don't have to invalidate the query or refetch it. I just know that like the data that query has fetched would have changed, but I've handled that change. And so, yeah, I'm going to get back all the correct data.
That's pretty cool.
For things like adding, deleting, updating, it's not that bad. Mm-hmm. Where I had a lot of trouble was where, let's imagine you're building something like Trello. And so you fetch a list of, let's say, boards or a list of columns. What do you call those columns in Trello?
Yeah, boards.
Lanes.
Lists. Yeah, lanes.
Fetch a list of lanes, and it's a GraphQL query. So then you also fetch each lane's task. It's like a nested GraphQL query, right?
Cards.
Cards.
Yeah.
So now you have like lane 1, it has 3 tasks. Lane 2, it has 2 tasks. And you drag a card from lane 1 to lane 2. If we were thinking about this in like an ORM world, we would say like, okay, we have a task and it's like lane ID is 1
Changed.
And we're going to update it to lane ID 2.
Right.
But in GraphQL, that doesn't really work, right? There's no notion of that in GraphQL, right? There's
You're saying you're going to have queries throughout the app that are referencing these things, but they don't know that fact that a card belongs to a lane.
Yeah, they're nested queries, and it's great. It's amazing that you can write that stuff in GraphQL.
Yeah.
But when it doesn't know that like you're reparenting task 1,
right?
For a task from lane 1 to lane 2. So
right.
You end up they give you a bunch of cache helpers, and you can learn how this works. But this is something I had to deal with, and I end up like reaching into like the original lane. I actually end up reaching into like all lanes, making sure that the task is assigned to the right lane.
So are you doing this in the code that is calling the initial query? Like
you are doing this in the code that the use
mutation.
Use mutation has options.
And so you go and find the query that's from the other page and fix the data.
So there's 2 ways you can do this. One is like when you have data normalization, you can just find the record. And so when it's like
source of truth.
Yeah. So like if I know that like posts have comments, I can just find the post and like remove the comment. Sorry.
Yeah.
if I know that like lanes have tasks.
Yeah, posts have comments. You find a comment and you like change its post ID or you delete it or something.
Yeah,
You
but
delete
you can't
the comment.
You would delete the comment.
And then other queries that use the post have many comments would update, but it doesn't quite work.
There's been times I think I have to learn this more. There's been times where I've had to like reach into individual queries and edit them, and there's other times we're working with the normalization. And I think what it comes down to is there's certain types of things where it's like the relationship is easy to figure out, and there's other things where you have like nested GraphQL queries where the relationship
maybe they're aggregates or something, or maybe they're not exactly.
Aggregates is actually a really good example here.
Mm-hmm.
So if we had a card count for a lane, we would have to go in and we would have
manually do that.
Yeah.
Yep.
So it
sounds like a nightmare, dude. I mean, it's like you said, it's powerful and it lets you do things you couldn't do without having client-side identity map, but then all the trouble we've had and seen companies have with, a big client-side cache that's supposed to be like a normalized subset of your data, it can just get really messy. It can get hard. When it works, it's like you said, when it works, it's great. When it doesn't, it's like, kill me now.
I don't know, like maybe I can give an update in a few months. I do feel like when I get it working, it's a superpower when I'm writing the code. Also, like the caching APIs are pretty high level. So you really gotta you're reading a lot of docs, a lot of examples, and it's like, I know what I just want to update this one thing. That's it. I know what
you almost want like a little mutable API, like where you just say, post.card count is now old post.card count -1, and like boom,
Yeah. It's man, it's funny. Like I go back and forth. It's like on one hand, it's good that it's like, here's your cache, do whatever you want to it. On the other hand, it's like, I know exactly what I want to do. Why do I have to be so verbose in the way I describe how you add an item to the cache?
Right.
So one thing I want to, I think that's really cool that Apollo does is the way you do optimistic updates is in your mutation, you can literally provide the response from the server. So I can do a mutation.
A fake response that you've made up before it comes back.
Yeah. And it is literally.
And it will take it as if that was what came back, and then it'll update it once it actually gets the real response from the server.
Exactly.
Oh, that's really cool.
And so it's almost like you have a fetch call where you're predefining the JSON response.
Yeah.
And it's really nice. At first I was like, oh no, this is so verbose.
Yeah.
But then I was like, this is so much better than just it's like the ultimate escape hatch, right? It's really the ultimate escape hatch. It's, how would you do an optimistic update? Well,
you're the one who gets to say what the server actually said. Yeah. Interesting.
And so that's been really cool. That's something I've really liked, that I can be like, oh yeah, I know the server. And again, I just go run the thing in graphical. I copy the response out of graphical and paste it right in. So I know what the response is going to be.
Interesting.
So that's like we always talk about like really low level escape hatches.
Yeah.
And I really appreciated that one.
Yeah.
Even though it feels verbose, I was like, wow, you can't get better than this.
Yeah, right. It feels bad in the sense because you're like, I shouldn't be, like, JSON is supposed to be, it's like more implementation detail-y. It's like transport, but then it's like, but at the end of the day, if you can intercept that and just change it to be whatever you want, then, get escape hatch.
It's funny. You're literally writing JSON with like _ type name equals.
Oh God. Yeah.
You are writing there is no shortcut here. You are writing the response from the server.
Right. Something that a server is supposed to respond with, and you're handwriting it.
Yeah. I have no idea how this stuff is going to scale. I've kind of looked around. I've seen people have made like libraries with little helper functions to do stuff. I don't really want to invest in them. So we'll see. I mean, part of me really, really does appreciate the Urkel SWR strategy of like, here's a query, I just rerun it when you come into this component.
Yeah. I've heard a lot of people who really like Apollo, so I think it'll be good to see how it goes. But I'm trying to push the stale wall revalidate pattern as far as I can and see if I can make a polished UI that I like without having to maintain at all or even have a notion of identity on the client.
Yeah.
And there are parts of my fitness app right now, just by happenstance, as an artifact of the way that I wrote it, that are weird, like because they are stale and then they revalidate. So that introduces some strangeness. And I've even seen it on like even the Vercel dashboard. Like, yeah, there's times where you click on it and you're like, wait, and then oh, okay, it's updated now. It's fine. A lot of times it works great and it's actually pretty good. Like, I find it works well for gets that have changed not as a result of an action you took. So I find it's okay if, let's say I have the Twitter timeline open and then I click back to it, it's like, yeah, it's just going to revalidate and that's great. And it's like, so in that case, if I click to an app and I see a change of state, this is what it is. Like you change code and you get push and you click back to GitHub and you have the PR open. And then all of a sudden the refresh button comes up because it says this is out of date. That's fine because I didn't click anything in the web app. So that is a stale while revalidate pattern because they're choosing to show me a stale page and then revalidating it, maybe through polling, maybe whatever, right?
Yep.
But that feels fine to me as a UX experience. But when I take an action in the app and then I'm redirected after, let's say, closing a PR back to the issues list or after creating a post back to the index page, and I see the stale thing and then I see the new thing, even though I was the one who just created it, to me, that's the problem.
Yeah.
So what I've done, again, what I want to do is try to push the stale while revalidate idea and see if I can get a polished UI, because not having the client cache and just having disconnected queries, my query for the homepage of my fitness app is like really weird. It's really weird, dude. It's like,
it's a query that the homepage needs. So the homepage is just like ad hocing just random crap that it needs.
Totally. It's weekly goals, ID total, it's nested category, and then it has this entries aggregate count. And then I have a summary, which is all my users, each of their weekly goals, each of their entries aggregate and count. So getting that like that, it was the best. It was the best. And I've written a lot of apps that have this kind of nested data requirements for an overview page or dashboard page, and getting it into the normalized thing where you would, with something like JSON API resources, I need this, include this. And then on the client, you ride the map filter reduce to get it into that form. You cannot beat this at all.
Yep.
So the problem is you lose identity because you're going through this stuff. So what I do in this one is, one thing you can do here, if you want to keep this query disconnected and not have your modal that's creating a goal have to reach in and modify it, right, is to just say, well, maybe you can just reach in and evict it. And you can just say evict it. And then so you create a goal. And then when you're redirected back to the home page, we know that we evicted this thing. And so we're just going to show the loading thing. Me as a user, I'd rather see that and see the loading thing again. And see fresh data than to see the stale thing, which is what I saw before I made a mutation, and then have it flicker and update.
Yep. And to be fair, Apollo does have an API for basically invalidating queries and evicting stuff.
Maybe you could do a thing where, like, if the user changes, if the category changes, and if the weekly goal changes, if any of those things change, then let's just evict this. And that way, like any part of the UI where you're making the ability to add or edit or delete those things, you won't even have to call mutate and like evict,
Yeah.
Still an open question though, man. Still not something I'm like, not a whole paradigm that I'm like really satisfied with. So I was hoping Apollo was going to have like no downsides. Silver bullet. Not silver bullet, but just that it was going to be more like, active rec, again, like you could probably write a generalized thing with Apollo that does preserve identity. So Urkel is a good example of this, because Urkel has the type name and ID. So it actually would know in my crazy homepage query that weekly goal with a type name of weekly goal and ID of 2 was in that. And so if someone goes and changes that, it's going to automatically evict that for me. So for me, that's pretty sweet. That's a pretty nice, happy medium. It's going to keep me productive in writing these crazy nested queries for my overview aggregate pages, but not have to think about tying them to an identity.
And you could probably opt into that with Apollo, right? Say like anytime I do a mutation that touches a goal, I'm going to loop through the cache and evict all these items that are even tangentially related to it.
But you just don't want to have to write a bunch of that stuff yourself in every app that you're doing. Like I want that stuff to be done for me from a library.
Yeah. Again, it's just back to this like, man, when it works, it's freaking sweet.
Yeah.
Like, it is
I do want to try it.
It is so sweet. But when you're writing the code, you're like, I'm just reaching in and updating stuff.
Yeah.
And I know that it's what the updates I'm doing are right and they reflect the data that the server just responded with. But yeah, it takes a lot more time than just Urkel saying like, okay, I mean, I'm just going to rerun this.
Right.
So.
Cool. Yeah. Interesting, man. Well, I'm sure listeners will be eagerly waiting the update here in a couple of weeks and see how it goes. But maybe next time we'll get to talk a little bit about the Offlink project you've been working on.
Yeah.
Because I'm excited about that one.
Cool.
Awesome. All right, y'all. I'm Sam.
I'm Ryan.
Thanks for listening to Front End First, and we'll see you next week.
See ya.
Bye.